So first, let me introduce the group up here. We have Cap Watkins here from Etsy. I had a really interesting conversation with him on the way in, so I know he's going to be real with you guys and not pull any punches. I can pretty much assure you of that.
I make no guarantees whatsoever.
And then we have Josh Brewer over here, ex-Twitter. So I also got the word that he is going to be a little bit more forthcoming about any problems he may have had with different decisions that may have been made at Twitter over the past few years. So that should be pretty compelling. And then he's like, I got my eye on you, dude. I don't want to hear anything. And then we got Shailin Amin over here from Uber. And I think he's going to have a lot of really interesting stuff to talk about from Uber's history over the past 2.5 years. It's been a super crazy ride for them. And they've gone through a lot. And have also a very kind of different type of service from, I think, what a lot of other people tend to work on. So he's got an interesting vantage point from that. Okay, so without further ado, the format is going to be basically the first half. I have a couple of questions for each of these guys. And then I'm going to open it up, and everybody else is going to be able to ask questions. Cool. So let's start with Shailin there and talk about Uber, I think. So I think one of the things that's really interesting about Uber is that this focus on the, hail a car kind of experience, And it just opens right up into the map, and like that's the primary focus. There's lots of other stuff you could think about doing, like setting the destination and making that more prominent and other kinds of stuff. You guys really seem to zero in on just making it as frictionless as possible to get a car. And then it's kind of stayed that way over time. So how did you guys kind of come to that? Did you just know to focus on that right away, or was there trial or error? Like, what's kind of up with that focus?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think over the I don't know even where to start with that. So I started as a contractor at Uber, kind of came in for a 3-week gig, and Travis was like, I need you to redesign this app, and I need you to do it in 3 weeks. And the project ended up being like 9 months long. And then he locked me in a room and was like, I'm not letting you leave until you sign. And so I ended up staying there for 2 years now. So, so it basically started off as a contracting gig. There was one designer there when I started, and Travis had no idea about what design was. Like, he was just like, I don't even know what design means. Like, what is the value of this stuff? And so it was El Luna, myself, and a few other product managers and Travis. And so it started off with, a lot of workshopping, which was basically like about a week to kind of get to know the customers and the product. And really, we were always driving for clarity, like what does this product do? What is the main function of it? And request a ride with a tap of a button, right? And so the prioritizations based around that were pretty clear. And then surrounding that UI around ETAs and destinations and search views, those conversations always came up, right? It's like, we need to make everything important, and when you start doing that, nothing becomes as important as it should be. And so the main focus was to always focus more on like minimizing design and just focusing on the core story. So if we started taking elements out, what was the story that the UI could tell? Were we losing people? Was it causing more confusion? And so, every day there's people that want to add stuff to the UI, and it takes a lot of restraint and constraint to kind of make sure that at the core, this is a tap a button and get a car, right? And we really realized that it's a two-step approach. Like, do all the stuff on what we call the map view, which is select a ride, enter a destination. And on the next view, it's basically what we call the confirmation view. So we took a very e-commerce approach towards it, and really didn't add anything that wasn't required on the confirmation view. Unless people wanted more information around pricing or whatever else, right? So I think it was by design, but it just takes a lot of constraint, time, and effort to make sure that you just don't overwhelm the user, right? With like social sharing, you're like, well, why would anybody want to post this to Facebook? Like, why? Doesn't make any sense. And it's really thinking hard and deep about the value add to the end user. So most organizations function around the business case, like what's best for the business. At Uber, it's really customer and client facing. And so we've been very fortunate and lucky to be able to get away from the needs of the business to a certain degree and focus mainly on users. So, yeah.
I have one free idea I'll give you.
Great.
You mentioned social sharing. So I was thinking, if you hail an Uber, and then it auto-generates a Foursquare check-in, which then blasts out as a multicast message to both Twitter and Facebook, I think that could be pretty solid. What do you think?
It's on the roadmap somewhere.
Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah, user acquisition is always an issue for us, and so we're going to get rid of promo codes and do that instead. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome. Solid. That one's free. Cap, I'm going to charge you for the one that's coming soon here. Josh, okay. So this is, I think, one of the more steamy and interesting questions about the history of Twitter. Yeah. Which is kind of, it came to a crossroads where you guys had to decide, are we going to be more of a media platform and a brand kind of platform, or are we going to go more in this direction of sort of a messaging and communication fabric, for the internet? And I think that was really a critical decision. It kind of seems like it ended up going more towards the media side, but I'm kind of curious, like, how do you think design is meant to inform that kind of decision and direction for a company? And what do you think of that, I guess, decision and how it was made, I guess?
Okay, so I'll get to what I think of it as I go along. But I think one of the interesting moments was around the end of 2010, early 2011. We were in this very decent growth curve, and more people were coming onto Twitter and using it for all kinds of things. You saw the earthquake in Japan, and it literally became like the emergency messaging service for Japan. And if I remember right, from since then, they've actually instituted Twitter as the public messaging service in case of any emergency, which to me is kind of awesome. I used to always joke that the UN should have bought Twitter and made it like the global messaging infrastructure because it kind of made sense. But obviously, because of the unique nature of Twitter, it's 140 characters, and it's real time, and it's distributed, it's asynchronous, all this stuff. There's a lot of complexity that's hidden in that simplicity, and we knew that more and more people were sharing more stuff. As bandwidth became cheaper, it became easier to share photos and videos and all that stuff, and we were hyper aware that people were sharing more photos, and when Instagram first started, they wisely bootstrapped off of Twitter's graph. Worked out well for them. Good job, Kevin. And we sat in this crux of so many decisions that needed to be made at the time, and there was a very righteous war within Twitter about, do you put photos in the timeline, or do you leave the timeline alone? And Mike's sitting here, and he came a little late to the war. Thankfully, we went towards photos. But honest to God, it was like you walked in the company, and there was some people were over here, photos, media, and other people were like, hell no, I will kill you if you put that in the, don't tweet that, because nobody said that, maybe. But it was really, honestly, on the design team, a few of us really started looking at the behavior behind this. And for me, I kept looking at okay, well, obviously, you don't want to compromise the speed and utility and the beauty of this real-time timeline. And the second you introduce photos, two things happen. The tweet with a photo gets more attention than the tweet without a photo, period. You can do eye tracking studies and the whole 9 yards. The company I worked at before that, Socialcast, we did it. We introduced photos, and this is an enterprise internal messaging platform, and you can't go back from a decision like that. So you don't introduce photos and then be like, just kidding, never mind. So it was one of those moments of okay, what do we do? And on the design side, we prototyped a couple of ideas that really basically took okay, what are the types of things people are sharing, and can we give people multiple timelines? Can we give them the type of stuff they want to consume at their leisure, and allow them to move over? So honestly, it was a keynote prototype that basically was okay, great, your normal timeline looks like your normal timeline. You swipe over, and there's your photo filtered view of the timeline. You swipe over again, there's article view of that. So it was just taking a object-centered approach to how we could solve a problem like that, putting more of the control in the user's hand of what they want to see when, without sacrificing the kind of, beauty or utility of the home timeline. That launched the redesign initiative in 2011, and about halfway through that entire process, we got the news that the API wouldn't support that. And sorry, we have to cut the thing that you like were hinging this whole thing on, but it's okay. Like, still continue on with the redesign. So, amongst that, the other piece of it was, you know, how many of you guys were ever fell victim to a DM fail? Anybody? Yeah, a few. Okay. DM fails were largely the result of SMS failures and our inability to type a space after the letter D. It wasn't actually a problem that you had once you were using an iPhone or a mobile client, and it happened a lot less on the desktop. But we had some very public DM fails, like, you know, with people in government and stuff. And
Can you tell us a couple of examples?
there's a guy whose last name is Bonner. Bonner, I don't know how to pronounce it, but that gives you enough, I think, insight into what he might have shared publicly, accidentally.
Wasn't it Wiener?
Oh, it was Wiener.
Yeah,
Not
yeah.
Bonner?
Not Bonner.
But there is a dude named...
Yeah, there's a,
okay,
there's
all right.
a Bonner.
That's awesome.
It's Wiener.
Thank you. Yeah. Either way, yeah. Inevitably, the internet always ends up there. But you know, there was internally in the company a fair amount of like, oh my God, what do we do? Do like public and private messaging? Like, how do we figure out ways to separate these two? And there was a camp of folks that were like, we don't need to separate them. We just need to make the private messaging experience very explicit that you're in a private messaging experience, and make the public sharing stuff obvious that you're in public. I was advocating for investing in direct messaging and like that whole part of it, because as soon as you form symmetrical relationships with people on Twitter, your engagement tends to go up and you tend to actually become a deeper relationship evolves. Not always, but more often. And unfortunately, I lost an argument because when we pulled the data up, only 3% of the user base used DMs. And so I lost, and it got buried like 3 taps deep in DM hell. And unfortunately, I think at that point we missed a giant opportunity to own private messaging in a way that I think few companies were poised to do. But it didn't, I don't think it actually hurt the product in the long run. It could be argued, you know, whether or not. But interestingly enough, in that case, design was arguing for it. Data said we shouldn't. And I think history has proved that we probably should have. So it was tough. I mean, some of those were really, really hard decisions. And even coming up with solutions that actually, I feel like, kind of like got both sides of this holy war to agree, we still weren't able to actually get out. So over time, it became obvious everyone wanted media in their timeline, and that's kind of the direction Twitter as a company headed. So.
A small follow-up to that I'm kind of curious about is like, so you mentioned like, 3% of the people using DMs. One of the things, I'm actually going to ask some questions like this to Cap especially, but when you have one of these platforms where a lot of the stuff is done by a smaller percentage of the people, right? And then you have a much larger audience which tend to consume more than they're actually producing or interacting. It might be that, that 3% were like power users that were creating a lot of stuff. Similar kind of thing could be true for example, lists or whatever, right? Where you have maybe the people that are more influential and doing all the stuff that a lot of other people are interacting with. Maybe they use this stuff a lot, and you're kind of throwing some of them under the bus, maybe. So did you ever get into any of those nuances about, the kind of consumer producer and how they might have different behaviors when you guys did this design?
So yes, at the time that that redesign and that whole process was happening, I think the nuance of understanding the different segments of users and the behaviors that went along with them was not anywhere near as robust and kind of detailed as what we have today. We being Twitter. Twitter's research team, honestly, like we brought in this amazing woman, Grace Kim, who has grown the research team and really like has driven that to the forefront of like product development and like a lot of stuff in the company. But at the time, I think our understanding was not nearly as rich or deep as I would have liked it to be. And I do definitely feel that that the 1%, 10%, 90%, kind of like creators and then hardcore consumers and then mass is very true on Twitter. And I mean, I honestly, I can't speak to a number of the product decisions around that, but there's no doubt that if you're building a product for a mass audience, you really can't underestimate how important your core users are. And it may seem like you're building something that like almost no one's using, but the ripple effect that it produces within your community is huge in most cases, especially if it's a media and kind of content forward experience.
Cool, awesome. All right, Cap. So a related kind of thing on this theme is that Etsy, is basically a two-sided market. That's what it is. So maybe even more strongly, you're in this situation where you're kind of always designing for these two sides of the market, right? So I'm kind of curious, like, how do you think that impacts how you make design decisions? Do you find that these two groups of customers sometimes have their goals out of alignment and run into problems with that? What's that like?
Does anybody not know what Etsy is? I get that sometimes people just don't know. It's okay, don't be ashamed. You can Google it later. Yeah, so Etsy is a platform. People can get on and sell things, and people can get on there and shop for those things. People compare us to eBay from time to time, which I don't like very much at all. Yeah, I mean, so the problem, right, is that like we have over a million active shops on Etsy that last year did $1.4 billion in sales. So the small portion of users is kind of important because they're making lots of cool stuff apparently that people would like to buy. So I think the hardest part actually isn't designing for two users. I think the hardest part is explaining to business owners why you're making changes to like essentially the public-facing view of their items in their shop, right? Because I think like it's really easy for us to like all of us that work in this stuff to realize that like we're using data, we're being very careful. Like we would never ship anything that hurts the ecosystem because we are so tightly knit to those folks, right? Like Etsy's entire livelihood is based on 3.5% of that $1.4 billion, right? So if that goes away, if we hurt that, like then we're hurting ourselves along with like the people that we're trying to service. So it's funny, we have forums at Etsy. And it's mostly all sellers. I mean, some buyers go there, but it's like kind of sellers get together and can talk about how things are going. And our VP of product at the time, Mark Headland, who's now at Stripe and in San Francisco, and you should chat him up on Twitter, he's great. He had started doing this like Q&A once a week with Etsy admin. So like you could like, it was like a thread where people could like put all their questions and people would vote up the questions, like other sellers would vote up each other's questions and we would answer them. And we kept getting these questions about like, why are you always changing things? Like, why are things always like looking different? Like, can't you just leave it alone for a little while? Like, et cetera, right? These are all like, we laugh, but that's a totally valid like thing to feel, right? I mean, how many times has Twitter redesigned, right? Do you remember the new Twitter? Me too. But like, and it feels strange to users, right? It feels like, why are you doing this? And he finally he wrote this incredible post. I'll have to go back and find it and link to it somehow, but like, he explained the product development process and went through how we experiment and how we run A/Bs and how we try like not just one thing, but probably like 30 things, 30 different versions of something before we finally decide to ship it. And that we would never, ever, ever, you can trust for sure, we would never ship something that hurts you because that's stupid of us. And that was pretty magical. Like I think that like after that, we started seeing like in the forums and stuff like sellers like who would come and ask a question about like why did they change this page. Another seller would be like, oh yeah, there's this great post by the VP of product. You should go read it. So that was pretty fascinating to me. Like it's really hard to explain what we do because like it's kind of, it feels like magic, I think, to most people. Just like someone who's making desks in their garage kind of feels like black magic to me. I don't know how they do that, but they do it. So that's like the biggest challenge, I think, for us. I mean, most of the stuff we do on the seller side is like we split the app apart, right? So we have like a separate selling app so we can really concentrate and focus on those features, and the buying app so we can really concentrate and focus on those set of features. But yeah, I mean, that's really the hardest part about it is like whenever we make changes to a search algorithm, to like the way your listing looks, to the way your shop storefront looks, like these are all things that like in the minds of our users are creating winning, like new winners and losers, basically in the marketplace, right? With every change we make, we're inadvertently selecting, oh, we made the photos bigger, so people with good photos are probably going to get like higher conversion rate. And like we just have to be really careful about making those choices like consciously and making them responsibly and making sure that like it's a net like big positive for the people that we're like really working for, who are our sellers, right? It's funny, our buyers don't seem to notice when we change things. We never hear about it. Like almost never. But yeah, sellers, like that's their business. So that's like the real hard part for us. Actually, an unrelated note, we've both been touched by Anthony Weiner.
Wait, you guys have been touched by Anthony Weiner, or
Wait.
you've touched him?
So hear me out on this. So I was at a conference last year, and it's like the day I'm supposed to talk, and I start getting these text messages from my friends that are like, holy crap, like, you're on CNN. When I searched for Anthony Weiner, you're in the Google results. And I was like, what the hell? And so like I searched for Anthony Weiner, and sure enough, there's like a blog post I wrote about. I used to work at Formspring, and Anthony Weiner used that to pick up like teenage girls or something. Like, it was terrible. It was terrible. There was like CNN articles, like Huffington Post articles, and they were all searching the internet for like some content about Formspring to link to, and I was the only one that ever blogged about Formspring. And so there's a link to my blog post about like why Formspring didn't work out, and that was linked in every single like news story. And so I'm going on and I'm like, oh my god, I hope no one Googles me or like Anthony Weiner today, because it's gonna be terrible. So yeah, that was awful. That guy sucks. DM fails. Formspring. He should not be on social media. He should be banned forever. It's terrible. Wow.
You look like you're kind of struggling with if you should reply to.
I am not going to reply because nothing I say
I think it can only get worse.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
agree. I think
It's
we
awkward
should
for
go.
me too. It's not your fault, Josh.
So Cap, I was wondering, is there anything like, is there something you can think of recently where like there's one feature, like let's say search, like how search works and how you index items, or some kind of a particular feature where like it influences both buyers and sellers, you know, as a feature, and it like is quite complicated for you to deal with because maybe their interests are at odds, or like, you know, the sellers really want something, but then that makes you do something else that's sort of weird or more complicated, you know, for the app for buyers, or not really?
There's stuff that exists like that. I think like in the past, I will say like, I mean like the Etsy selling experience so far, like I mean we're dealing with a lot of legacy stuff. Like when I started Etsy, there were 12 designers. The year before that, I think there were like 6 or 7, and before that there were like 4 and 2. And like we're talking about it was a pretty big organization even back then. So we're still playing catch up on a lot of things, and like we built a lot of stuff just like every startup does. You're just building really fast. You're like adding the features, like doing the stuff. And so right now, is anybody seller on Etsy? Oh, come on. There's a room full of creative people. You can do it. We have an Etsy seller on the design team who sells embroideried emoji. So get it together.
Can you give me the handle on that?
It's great. It is great. Her poop one is the best one. It's like the emoji poop with like the smiley. It's fantastic. So we have a lot of legacy stuff. We've implemented a lot of features that like sellers will hack the features to solve a problem they have, right? And it actually like doesn't help the way we've implemented that feature doesn't help the buyer like get to the thing the seller's doing. Like an example would be like a seller wants to put all their items on sale and wants like a buyer to know they're having like a seasonal like, oh, it's just after the holidays, like all my stuff's on sale, like 10% off. We have no way to do that right now. Like you'd have to go through and like mark down all of your items, put like an announcement. There's this thing called an announcement in your shop you can like type out, and it's just not very visible. We haven't done a very good job with it. And so people are like just typing it in the announcement in this huge block of text and like trying to get a buyer to read this. Like it's like in 12-point font on the front of the homepage. It's like we just have not done a very good job of like solving the problem. And we get feature requests for like, oh, I want to like edit all of my item descriptions at the same time. and like just add a single like piece to every single description or add something to every single title. And it's like, okay, well, we could add that, but that sounds like it wouldn't be so great like for buyers on the other end, also very complicated to build. And so we have to like look deeper than that and look for the problem they're trying to solve. So like, I'm trying to put all my stuff on sale, or I'm trying to like mark everything as like mark these exact items as seasonal, or like, I don't know. There's just so many, or free shipping on these couple of items or whatever. So we're trying to like look past the feature request, which is something that I think a lot of people, like a lot of companies seem to fail at, is like they just implement the feature that's being requested without looking at like, why is that being requested at all? Like DMs is actually really interesting. It's like, that should have been a messaging service. That was the problem that like should have been solved. But it seemed like it was just like, it felt like it was always considered like back channel, like back channel chatter that wasn't very valuable. Like it's like, it always like felt like that was the positioning. But it really, the problem we were trying to solve was like, there wasn't a really good way to like reliably message each other, like conveniently from this like messaging service, which is really interesting. Exactly. Wow, that like you just illuminated so much for me.
Yeah, we've definitely seen in because we crawl lots of stuff on the internet and we see a lot of stuff from Etsy, and have definitely noticed in the descriptions, definitely the sellers hack. They do all kinds of hacks, right, with all kinds of different Unicode characters and all kinds of stuff to try to express different sort of they're wanting certain features.
Well, and there's no limit on the description field. The limit is how big can it get in the database, right, is the limit. It's like 14,000 characters or something. Like it's some like preposterous amount. And like people fill that like with stuff. And it's incredible. I've never seen anything like it. And it's hard to like go back from something like that too, right? How do you roll away from that feature? You just can't.
140 characters.
Right. That's what I was going to say.
Right. I thought about that.
All right. Let's go on to Shailin again here. So this is one that I think is really interesting for people, especially when, in light of all the global statistics of how important, it's going to be in the world. I don't know if some of you guys know sort of like GDP stats and stuff like that, but from like 20 years ago or so, America and Europe was about 80% of the global GDP. Within the next 50 years or so, we're projected to be about 35% of the global GDP. So Asia, Latin America, Africa, these will be 65% of global GDP. So a huge issue, right, that for us in the Silicon Valley, and we're very insular oftentimes, to think about is for designing globally. And I think especially companies like Uber or Airbnb or these kinds of things where you have these quick scaling and expanding rollouts in different cities and in different countries, I think are super interesting. And I'm just curious, like as you've rolled out in different cities and in different countries, if you've found like a big impact on design, or what's design been like, and how have you been involved in that kind of stuff? Because I think that's pretty interesting. Or is it just all the same and there's no issues ever when you switch to different countries?
There's definitely a lot of issues. I mean, design globally does not translate well. Internally, we've had to build a lot of systems in place to help us translate. I mean, translations, once you go global, that's a disaster. Germany, I hate you. Like, hate you.
Like a sentence is one word.
Yeah.
It's one word. It's like 140 characters.
Yeah.
Is one word.
Man, it's a disaster. And so I've designed this UI that's perfectly fitting for English characters, and it's like it's already small enough type that like I get shit from my CEO all the time. Like the type is too small. But do any of you guys think the type is too small in the Uber app? By the way.
Yes.
Really? Damn it. He's winning.
I may or may not need glasses.
Yeah, okay. I'll make a note of it. Anyway, so you go to Germany, and there's 15, 16 characters for a word. There's umlauts and ascenders, descenders, like it's crazy. So we've built in an internal translation system that helps us kind of, we put in words for cancel and fare split and whatever else, and then we have international cities. Essentially, the locals of that city translate what fare split means. And Italians it's an entire sentence to explain what pickup location means, right? So design is a huge consideration. I think when we're designing, though, it's really difficult on this tiny screen to design for every use case. Like I've never been to Shenzhen. Like I've never been to Dubai, right? And so at some point, we're going to have to start considering different UIs based off of different countries, one design never fits all, right? And so it's really difficult. But I think the biggest part of our UI is that map, right? And maps work very differently in different countries. Like in China, you can't even use Google data. You have to use some Alibaba map that basically reverse and forward geocodes, and there's all sorts of complications around that. But designing internationally has come up. We haven't really come up with a solution for that. It's extremely difficult. I think the biggest challenge is that tiny screen. And considerations around that are just making the type smaller, which I know you guys love. But it's an extremely difficult thing. The other part is scaling for our business and creating a UI that allows us to scale from not just a single option of a vehicle, but maybe 4 or 5. It's always thinking about scale and how are other cities going to do things differently. You talked about buyers kind of hacking the system. We have regional folks in different cities kind of hacking the system, which is the Uber platform, right, to kind of accommodate for their needs. So, in New York we have baby seats, right, and that's not a vehicle. That's a vehicle with a specific object inside of it with a surcharge. And so, how do you design for something like that? And so, designing for scale is like the hardest part about internationalization. I think it's not just thinking about the US use case or even languages. It's thinking about all the possible use cases that people want to accommodate for. And it's a hard problem, but we're 40 people and I think we need more. So design's always thinking about internationalization, but we're growing too fast to consider it on a day-to-day basis. It's difficult.
I gotta ask now that you mentioned the baby seat thing. Earlier on, he was explaining to me, the little bar that they have right above, like, call my car, where you can flip it in between the UberX and the black cab and all that stuff, right? So he was saying when they designed that, they designed it to handle up to 7 different options. So I'm kind of curious if you guys have actually thought about options maybe being unique to different locations. Is that like a possibility maybe? Like in the desert, could I get a dune buggy, for example?
Yeah, I mean, we've always been experimenting with things, right? Christmas trees, kittens, jack-o'-lanterns, whatever. Those are all experiments, but the experiment has always been, accommodating for as many different options as possible. So it's definitely things that we should be considering as far as UI. But as you're designing an app, you have to think about not just the short-term but long-term frameworks for vehicle options, but also experiments, Christmas trees. And in a screen that's that big, it's really difficult to kind of predict the future of what other cities are going to do, such as car seats, and how that's going to work.
So another one is like, do you have density like relative to kind of like how long, how big a city is? Meaning, like, let's say you're in a really big city, but you don't have enough density of cars and you're just starting out. Do you have this issue where you have like a huge difference in kind of the experience that this person's going to get because they're getting a car from like a long distance away versus like in San Francisco or New York where you're most likely getting an average pickup time of like 3 to 5 minutes or something like that? Do you have these sort of logistical things in different places that cause you to like have really strained experience considerations?
Yeah, I mean, I think our brand promise is to deliver a vehicle within 3 to 5 minutes, and our operations teams, no matter what city, Tulsa, Armadillo, whatever city that we're in now, work extremely hard to get that supply within that 3 to 5 minutes. They're really finely tuned into what they do and the tactics that they employ. Generally, when you go to a city that's, even Columbus, Ohio, I think the estimated ETA is anywhere between 3 and 8 minutes. Atlanta, Georgia, which is a massive, very spread out city, they have the same thing. I think we're in North Bay, East Bay, South Bay, and generally anywhere within those areas, it's between 3 to 5 minutes. So the promise of delivering a vehicle within that time is critical. It's what people rely on us for. We generally don't change. Yeah, there are certain times where it's going to be 12 minutes, right, at 2 o'clock in the morning. But for the most part, on peak hours, we generally have 3 to 5 minutes, and it'll be constrained at times. Yeah.
So basically, you guys oftentimes aren't dealing with like a city by city, like funky set of extra constraints, because you're kind of like logistically saying, you know, this is our design goal on the logistics side that we want to hit for the quality of the experience.
Yeah, I
we
mean,
want to deliver.
it's the brand promise that we're always delivering on, right? So operations, driver ops, community managers, designers, regional managers and GMs, they all know that like our brand promise is 3 to 5 minutes. Like, supply the city as much as you can with drivers before you launch in there. So
When you guys decided that, were you involved? Was design involved, or was that before you joined? Like, I'm kind of curious how that became kind of like, this is the brand promise.
I can't remember when it started. Yeah, I think when I first moved back from New York to San Francisco to redesign the app, it wasn't consistently 3 to 5 minutes, and we only had black cars. I think as we started launching other options, taxis, UberX, that's when the supply was great enough to kind of fulfill on that promise. But I think for Travis, it was always, anything between 3 and 5 minutes. Yeah.
Nice. Cool. Yeah. All right, Josh again. Cool. So this is another one about, Twitter in flux. So I think, Twitter has over time also had this other kind of issue of dealing with the fact that it's this kind of massive real-time stream where there's all these different streams, and you can sort of slice and dice it in a million different ways, and you can view it in a million different ways. And they've tried to deal with sort of this discovery tab, and ideas are being floated around all the time of there's going to be a local view or an event-based view, and this is why there's hashtags so people can click on those and go to that type of a view. So there's this issue, and now currently on the Twitter nav, right? I think on most of the mobile apps you have this sort of double nav action going on because there's this swipe between these different views, and then there's also the typical top-level nav. So it sort of has a bit of a funky nav thing going on, and I think it has a lot to do with just getting the semantics and the mental model right is honestly hard, which is something I can appreciate because you really could show so many different views. So it is a bit tricky to decide, how do you help the customer navigate this whole world of information. So I think it's an interesting problem. I'm kind of curious what you think about it and the decisions you've seen or been a part of over the years.
Sure. I will start by the giant caveat that it's coming up on a year since I left. So decisions that have been made in that time I can't comment on. I can only speculate. Mike Kruseniski is here in the audience, and you can all find him later and corner him. I owe you a bottle of scotch for doing that. Ironically, I actually was hired to design and think through the very first events experience on Twitter. You're all wondering what events experience, and that would be because we got about 3 months into it and realized that we couldn't actually deliver on the experience that we believed should actually happen. Now, this was summer of 2010 through the fall. Myself and the PM on the project had the wonderful fortune of going into the CEO's office and telling him that we shouldn't do this, even though like it was the future of the company and things like that. But I bring that up only because it was one way of slicing Twitter, and in certain moments it was extremely compelling why this needed to happen. The Super Bowl, Oscars, these giant global events. It was like, oh my God, Twitter's so amazing for this stuff. And you realize the long tail of that doesn't quite hold as well. And there's just a lot of considerations around, can we deliver, number one, the right experience? Can we give people what they're looking for in the moment? And can we then build that into the mental model and kind of framework of Twitter as a whole? In my time there, we iterated on a number of different versions of that idea. I'd say that search today has actually come a long, long way, and especially when there's something actually happening, there's usually a really, really strong, very kind of media and people-centered view of that thing, which I think is really good. The architecture of Twitter, as you mentioned, was something I spent a lot of time thinking about, a lot of time working on. The array of things you could want out of Twitter is literally as infinite as every person using Twitter. You know, lists, I think, were a...
That's finite, actually, Josh.
Sorry. Fair enough. Sorry. I think there's a lot of people, but you're right. Eventually it runs out. Man. All right. Can't argue with that logic. But, you know, one of the things that I still hold as something I'd love to see happen, Mike, are you writing this down? Is actually like just giving more control to the user. I've been a huge advocate at Twitter long before that, but obviously I think there's this interesting balance. If you give too much control, you end up with MySpace. If you take it all away, you end up with Facebook. And I think that there's a really beautiful in-between where both the product itself shines through and the users themselves have a way to express their perspective, their interest, their view, and have it reflected back to them in the product. And I think ways of going about that, they are by no means simple solutions. I mean, everything regarding that product is deeply complex because of the just like ripple effect of one change here actually touches so many other pieces of the product because it all is built off this one building block of the tweet, right? And a lot of our design decisions and a lot of Twitter's experiments and even since I've left, the iterations they've done in the product they point to me that everyone is still thinking about this, that everyone is still grappling with. There's so much information, there's so much that's actually relevant to me. How do we deliver that in a meaningful way? I think going forward, and this is not a Twitter-specific commentary, this is kind of just like general interneting commentary, is we have to figure out how to summarize better. And I mean, you guys, I think, are actually in an interesting space around figuring out how to present people with the stuff that actually matters to them. But Facebook's newsfeed algorithm, like no one I know that's a kind of just normal person understands what the hell is going on with that thing. Like if you tell them there's actually an option where you can see everything with most recent, most people I know are like, you mean I don't see everything? You know, and it's almost like pulling the curtain back and showing them there's no great Wizard of Oz. It's terrifying to them, and suddenly you've unraveled the fabric of their, their Facebook universe. But what it says is that, like, with the increase of information that we're sharing, companies and products that can help deliver a concise and like tailored chunk of content to you, I think are going to stand the best chance of winning your favor and your loyalty over a long time.
Yeah, one of the things we've been struggling with a lot lately is this issue of, building top-level views into the nav structure in some way, whether it be like on a nav bar or in some other kind of more explore mode or whatever, versus kind of like having calls to action to check out other things, built in or whatever. So in some products like, I was looking at, I think Feedly a couple of weeks back, has like a couple of rows of stuff at the top that are kind of, like the top stuff from your friends or like world news or whatever, and then a bunch of other stuff, trying to kind of bake it in more to that primary experience. What do you think about that? Like, what's your take on kind of like how do you get people to see other stuff besides just like the home feed experience, which we all know is working on like Twitter and Facebook or whatever? Like, how do you deal with this issue that you have other stuff you want to showcase somehow, but like if we put too much, it becomes sort of a nuisance and people don't want all this extra stuff?
So you're balancing that, like, I mean, because for all intents and purposes, you're advertising other parts of your product, and I'd argue that it's
selfie ad.
It's less advertising than actual ads, but it still appears like advertising. However, if it's contextually relevant, it tends to, I believe, people find that, I think, less offensive and more inviting when it actually like meets you in the moment. And it, like you were pointing out, like these screens are tiny, and like you get 5 navigation elements on the screen. You know,
Hamburger nav.
What's that?
Hamburger nav. I'm just
We have an internal email thread about that
Man.
one. I'll forward it along.
Now, there's an argument to be made that actually, like, if you just train everyone that everything's always over there, okay, I don't think that's a good idea, but there's an argument for that. But, you know, I mean, to be fair, you know, on, I'll just pick on the Twitter app since we're on that. There's 5, if I remember correctly, across the bottom, and then there's 1, 2, 3 action items at the top, and then depending on which thing you're in, you can swipe over 3 more things. So, like, literally, it's about as loaded as you can get, and trying to still not be, like, horribly in your face. But there were countless iterations and explorations around how do we do this contextual introduction, right? I've seen a bunch of other apps do very similar things. When I was at Socialcast, we built an entire flow for the new user experience around meeting you in the moment. So the first time you ever went to do something, then we would kind of talk to you about what it was, instead of making you do the 9-point close every effing button, you know, bubble on the screen, and, you know, actually just let people use the product. And when they run into a brick wall, be there to explain either how to do it correctly or to guide them to the thing that they were looking for. That's way harder. Just totally honest. Like, it's just harder because you can't design for every single one of those scenarios, and so you have to kind of like find high-level ones that you think are going to reach the largest audience, and then pay a lot of attention to what people are doing with that. Is it working? Are they finding the things? If they find those things, are they then deriving more value and returning to them? And if so, are they creating new cow paths? And, you know, one of the things I used to talk about a lot was like, hey, before we go blow everything up, can we at least like go check and make sure that we're not going to demolish the I-5? Like, if everyone's used to going this route, but we want to change it for some other reason, you better be damn sure that not only did you create a better route, but you probably need to over-communicate, and you probably need to put a press release out, and you probably need to go hold people's hands, and, you know, maybe actually walk them through the app personally, which doesn't scale. But you know what I'm saying? Like, so paying attention to those types of things in that context becomes extremely important.
Nice, awesome. All right, so Cap, we've come to your second question here. So I think Etsy is, you know, like you were saying, you hate it when people call you eBay or whatever, or I'm sure like an Amazon or something like this, because you guys are an e-commerce sort of site, but at the same time, it is a community and very different in a lot of ways from those products. So I'm kind of curious, how do you deal with this whole designing community versus designing the product, and is it the same thing, and how do you guys operationalize all this and work together?
So it's funny, I worked at Amazon too, so I also would get really offended if also it's very different. Actually, on the eBay thing, the last conference I was at, I sat down next to the guy on the panel with me, one of the guys on the panel, he turned to me and goes, hey, you know, I just bought a car on eBay. And I was like, cool, man, I guess that's cool. And after a couple minutes, I realized he thought I worked at eBay. It was really awkward because we got up there and the woman said Etsy, and I saw him just go like, oops. I was like, yeah, if he said I bought a car on Etsy, I'd have been like, whoa, that's probably illegal. No, actually, so we productized a lot of the community stuff. So we have forums. So that's just like one thing. We actually productized it in a way that we even use it as tooling for features we're building. So, so we do a lot of A/B testing at Etsy. I'm sure if anybody's read Code as Craft, or anything, you've probably read all about this. Lots and lots of that were very highly data driven, and that's mostly on the buyer side because we don't It kind of sucks to A/B test on business owners, right? It sucks to screw with someone's workflow while they're trying to do it, and then oh, it was an A/B, so now you go back to the old thing, right? It's just we try not to do that. And so the way we had to get around that is because we still need to like be able to ship to some small percentage of those folks, right? So we had in the past, so we'd created forums, and we also created this feature we called Teams, where sellers could like self-organize, basically however they wanted, and create like these like subgroups that had their own little discussion threads and things like that they could create. So like photographers in San Francisco or woodworkers in Brooklyn or whatever, like they could like create their space and then like have discussions about their craft and what they're doing, or like we're all going to this craft fair or whatever. So we had this feature. And I don't know how this happened or who did this, but like someone figured out that we could feature flag a team. And so now what we do is we create these like small micro communities. We flag it for like whatever this new feature is. So like if you're in the team, it's on for you. And people can leave the team leave teams anytime. They can come in and out as they please. And then we invite sellers to like come into the team, telling them what the feature, or like here's what the feature is. Like it's how we like test out like what are we doing? We like have done like a new flow for buying shipping labels, for instance, and like we're not sure that that's going to be better, and we don't want to A/B it because we don't want to screw with someone's workflow when they're getting like 100 orders a month or something like that. So, so we invite these sellers in to a team, and now all of a sudden they're part of a prototype and they're using a feature, and we have a discussion thread automatically inside of there that they can leave us feedback. It's actually kind of a beautiful thing, and helps us like test things out before. It's more qualitative, obviously, and we can't get significance or anything like that, but I mean, we don't really look for that in the selling side. The other thing we do is everybody at Etsy does a support rotation twice a quarter, and this is a lot more buyer-focused than anything else. So you go and you sit with some of the support team and a few other like non-support Etsy folks, and you answer emails in the, we call it, they have a entire support queue called the bunny slope. And so you're in the bunny slope, and it's basically answering the fun emails or the easy emails, because you know you're only there for a few hours, and like it would take so long to explain all of our policies to like me, essentially. It's really geared towards the audience. And but anyway, so it's stuff like this is how we started to think about redesigning our listing page, which we did last year. Was that we were sitting in support rotation, and every single time everybody would get this question where it would just be like someone had gone to the help link to contact Etsy, had gone through all the prompts, and had sent us an email, and all it would say is like, "Can I get this in blue?" And I have no idea what they were looking at. And it was like, and it made it super clear that like buyers on Etsy didn't understand that they were buying from a person. They thought they were buying from us, which is weird because that's like our entire that's the entire reason we exist. Is that you're buying from a person, right? That's like that's our product moat. That's why it's different from Amazon, but nobody got that, and we just realized we weren't doing a very good job of communicating that. Although it is really fun to send people links to things that are blue. We do get those requests sometimes. We're a little more specific. They're like, "Oh, I'm looking for this kind of ornament or something," and you get to spend like an hour of your support rotation finding Etsy links and like pasting them in an email and sending them. It's pretty glorious.
Sending them to yourself, you mean, right?
Probably. Yeah. Yeah, I'm like, that was a good idea, good gift idea. Yeah, and the other thing we do, I mean, like, we do a lot of stuff. Like, we have craft nights at Etsy, obviously. Like, we do a lot of in-person things, a lot of seller events. Everybody that works at Etsy, when they go home for like the holidays or something like that, or if they go on a trip to like a conference, Etsy will fund drinks with sellers in that area for that person to like, so we'll organize it for them, and like they can go show up at this like bar or like coffee shop, and like we have like using Teams basically, we find the sellers in that area and like get them to like come, and they can like just talk to someone who works at Etsy for a while, which is pretty magical, I think. Yeah, I mean, I've talked to sellers on the phone after launching a feature that didn't go so well. I've definitely been on the phone with sellers. Yeah, I mean, it's just like Etsy's a very human thing. That's, again, like the product moat, and we really try to embody that as much as we can, and I think that's how we build the community. It's actually like a lot of Etsy employees are sellers, or even were sellers before they started Etsy. We had a woman leave recently because her shop got too successful, and so she like decided to pursue that full time, and she left the company. And I was just like, wow, I guess if you have to leave somewhere, it's like, did someone leave Twitter because they got too popular on Twitter, right? Or like it's just like, it's.
I'm gonna leave to be a driver at some point.
Right? That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
They make like 45 to 90,000 a year, so.
Yeah, you're gonna be like,
out.
Travis, look,
Yes.
my Uber business is doing too well.
Yeah. Sorry, this is too much stress.
Me and my Prius are hitting the road. Sorry.
Yeah.
Keep
A
that in
minivan,
mind, you
minivan.
guys. Flip it to the SUV, and you might see Charlotte driving.
It's going to be a minivan, no doubt.
Okay, all right. I want to open up for questions now for everyone else to ask some stuff. So ask anything you want. It's all fair game. Who has a fun question? All right.
So for an app that basically just has like one or two main screens, and that those screens have like pretty much stayed the same over the last however many years, like what are like sort of the major design projects that you guys take on? Like what are you guys thinking about, sort of every day if you?
I can't relate at all.
That is the best question ever, right? Like,
Yeah.
why do you need so many designers at Uber? Like, why is it? Like, I just love that question.
Yeah, so I'm going to do the safe answer. I can't talk about that.
Yes.
I know. We were talking about this, how we can't be translated. But for a long time, we've been super focused on clients, focused on the rider experience. Right? It was our main product. It's part of our brand, and behind the scenes, the new focus, or in parallel, has been all about drivers. Right? Drivers for so long have had the same app for about 4 years. And while it's very simple and very easy to use, it's like a single tap every time. Everybody, I'm sure, has a million different product ideas around how to make that better. And so, starting to focus on more driving or driver-related issues is top priority, because those guys they make the most exciting part about working at Uber actually is not actually for the client stuff, unfortunately. It's really for the drivers for me. There's just some crazy stories about an immigrant family coming to the U.S. and trying to raise their family, and there's stories about this guy who used to work at a cab company, made like 30 grand, eventually came over to Uber and now has a fleet of like 6 cars, sending his kids to school, to college. Like it's just kind of gnarly and like game-changing shit that like you just want to work on driver stuff. And so there's actually a guy who named his baby after an engineer that introduced him to Uber, which is another story. But it's really the impactful stuff. And so most of our focus is, not most of our focus, there's focus everywhere, but driver stuff is pretty important for us. And stay tuned. Next couple of months, yeah.
Start driving. Yeah.
Start driving.
All right, who's next? I'm waiting for a hand. Don't be shy. Nobody has any more questions, honestly? Okay, there we go.
Yay.
All right, yeah.
So I know that at least one of you is a fan of Designers Should Code, and I know that's often contentious. And actually not what I want to debate. I'm curious about, do you extend that to other oft-neglected branches of design? So, for example, should all designers do their own user tests? Should all designers do their own content strategy? And if not, how do you prioritize what designers should do?
Yes. Actually, it's funny, designers at Etsy do, until even recently, we're kind of doing their own user testing. So we just hired we just started our user research team at the end of last year. And it's like, I think we're at 6 or 7 now. Obviously not enough user researchers, right? We're still hiring. But designers, like, I don't know. Saying designers should code was like a weird way to say it, but I actually think it's more than that. It's like anybody on a team working on something should be involved in all the parts of the team working on something. It's like I think designers should code, but I also think engineers should be like deeply a part of the design process, right? I think engineers and designers should be part of the product process and the road mapping of the process, right? And at Etsy, like, that's just something we value very deeply. And as we've hired user researchers on, like, obviously, like, I want engineers, PMs, and designers all to be part of the user research sessions. It's funny, one of the teams I manage is doing, it's a seller team, which means we're doing a lot of user research, right? Like, we were so happy to have user research because, like I said, we can't really A/B. So now we're in a cadence for like every 2 or 3 weeks, like, user research. We're shipping to user research, right? And everybody gets in a room and like streams the user research sessions, like all the engineers and the designers, and like even if they're at their desks, like they all have like the little like streamer window like sitting in the corner, and they're all watching and like chatting about it in IRC as it's happening. And it's like, I don't know how we did that. It was a total accident. Like no one said like you have to do this, but it's just something that's like highly valued and I think highly valuable. I don't know that like. I mean, the reason we hire people who want to do everything is because it shows they'll stretch and they'll like try to figure out why this is an engineering constraint. Like, what is the problem? And understand it beyond just like, hey, we can't do this, right? And an engineer to understand why the solution is the best solution. Like, we're having conversations now where like the engineers will say like, I know this is the best solution, and I wish we could do this, but here are the reasons we can't. And the designer's like, okay, interesting. Like, let's figure out a different way, and like they sit down and figure it out. Whereas like I've definitely worked places where it's been like, we can't do that. Okay, and they throw it back over there's like throwing it back and forth over a wall. And that's why we do support rotations. I mean, it's just like everybody should know what's going on with everything, because that's how we build holistic products. Like,
But that is technically different than everyone should do all those things.
yes.
Just pointing
Sure.
out, like, just because
You know,
if
you
everybody,
got gotcha'd earlier. Is this
it's not,
like
it's not.
is
I'm
it coming
just-
back at me?
No, I'm just pointing out that, like, you know, I agree with you, but there's a nuance to this that I don't think actually comes out in a lot of the online kind of discussions of this, which is that, like, yes, there should be empathy across the team. There should be a shared understanding, and there should be actually some level of understanding as much as can be and participation. But if honestly, if I did all those things, I might not actually do the thing I'm hired for or good at, or you know what I'm saying? Like there's a very fuzzy line in there where
Yeah.
doing
I-
it versus being aware of it are
I think this kind of speaks to the conversation. Like it comes up all the time of product designers. Have you guys heard of this term, product designers? And then you
Never.
ask,
Don't be like
you
that.
ask
Is that?
you ask people what does that mean, and everybody has a different answer for that.
It's because they're all wrong except me.
Well, you're absolutely
just
right.
kidding.
You're
Just
absolutely
kidding.
right. So I think this is a fuzzy term that's been thrown around in our community, and product design to Facebook means something completely different than Etsy or Twitter or whatever else. That's one part of the conversation, right? It's expecting everybody to know everything at all times and being really good at it. The other part of like the conversation is like, as a designer, curiosity and passion should run deep in you, so that you want to. I mean, it's just part of growing and learning and becoming a better designer. It's like, yeah, so my title does not include business strategy or coding or research or user experience, but fuck it, like I'm gonna fucking learn that shit. Like, it's gonna make me a better person. I can have better arguments and understand why things are getting built.
Did you guys tweet that out? I hope so.
You should totally do it. That was awesome. But that's what makes designers designers. And in today's day and age, like you can't just hire somebody who's awesome at dribble shots. Like you gotta have somebody who is a good storyteller, who's able to kind of do user experience, who's able to do research, right?
well, Dropbox would argue with that, because I'm not throwing them under the bus. They hire illustrators
Yeah.
to work alongside some of their product designers to create a compelling visual language and story. So I'm
Yes.
just
calling it out.
saying.
I think partnering up with somebody who is a pure illustrator, but the expectation of having a core competency beyond just illustration.
Well, they have to
moving on
learn how
something
to
else.
write Objective-C as well.
Yeah, that's great.
I mean, duh.
Yeah,
we-
so
I mean,
product
we have
design
designers.
it's a weird, fuzzy term. And I don't think I've seen so many articles lately on it, but nobody really knows what that means, and the expectations from organizations, like what is a product designer. That's something that we all, I think, need to work on.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it needs to be standard. I just think you need to have it defined.
Yeah.
Like I need to, like you need right for yourself,
For your
company,
organization.
for your
Yeah.
organization,
Yeah.
right? It's like
Yeah.
we at Etsy we expect user experience design, visual design, and front end implementation. Like that's it. And anything beyond that, like I mean, we have designers who like are sending a bunch of engineers to Big Nerd Ranch to learn Objective-C and Java, I guess, for Android.
Yeah.
And like half the design team like emailed me and was like, "Can I go to that?" And yes, absolutely you can. And so we sent them, and like some of the designers have been getting together in the morning to like with some of the like iOS engineers, and have been like learning Objective-C.
Yep.
Like some of them are tweeting like screenshots of the apps that they've been creating at like 8 in the morning because they just it's like I think it's like you just can't take not knowing. Like there's like something about it that like you knew that if you knew it, it would be better off, and you could have like you could build better products.
How many times do you get tired of engineers saying, you can't do that? And you're like, okay, I'm going to walk away from you right now and trust you. And you're just like, no, I'm not going to take that as an answer. Like, let's talk about this, right? So it's just having a pointed argument and knowing what you can and can't do. Like, you don't have to be an expert in it necessarily, but like when I first started growing up in design, it was I started learning HTML and CSS and iframes and all that stuff, and that was iframes. Yeah, big deal. I once made it like a 32-page iframe thing. Anyway,
I thought you were going to say tables, and then I was going to be like, oh, okay.
No, I did tables too. And it's just knowing the language and the capabilities of technology, design, research, and engineering, and content, and like you just got to dive into it. You can't. You're not expected to be the expert, but as long as you have the ability to talk to other folks in that field, then you should be good. So,
I saw a designer at Amazon argue, essentially explain to an engineer how something should be built because they were telling us we couldn't do it. And we got to the end of his explanation, and this engineering manager was like, "Oh, yeah, that would work." And like we built that. Like he was like describing well, we would store it over here, and then like we would go access it at this point, and then like return it over here. And this guy couldn't code really. I mean, this designer couldn't code, and like he was just sitting there. He's like he understood conceptually enough to like have seen it before and understand kind of like why it worked that way enough to re-explain a way of doing something that like then we wound up implementing, and it was awesome. Like I was just like, I walked out there just like, oh my God, you're amazing.
Yeah, I think that's like the trend in product design, and why you're hearing people talking about it all the time is because it's kind of like a need for design to step up and take more on, not in terms of being able to like crank out code or whatever, but in terms of being able to like think about different goals and trade-offs. You know, whereas like historically it's like you've got the visual designers, they're bringing in sort of brand, you've got the UX designers, they're bringing in sort of user goals, right? And then the PM is sort of running the show, they're synthesizing all the numbers and all this other stuff, and sort of the designers weren't really doing a lot of that. And I think what's happening now is we're looking for more, designers to understand more of what's going on and step up more and understand all these different objectives and the business objectives and so on. And
thought leaders.
Thought leadership.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I would love some designer to step up and be like, guess what, PM? Guess what, engineers? Like, I have thoughts too. Like, let's talk about this. And like, instead of just being like, you doodle and make great things, like, just like true leadership. And that comes from absorbing knowledge and spending time and really becoming a master of that craft, right?
Well, how many times have you heard like a designer complain about how like the rest of their team doesn't get the design process, right? Like so many times. Like I totally have complained about that before.
Yeah.
But I think like the only reasonable way to like, it's only reasonable for us to want them to be a part of like what we're doing and to be involved in our process and get our process if we like are willing to go the other way too, right? Like it's like, it seems pretty unfair to just be like, oh, well, you need to come like be a part of the design process, and like I don't really need to understand what you're doing though, right? Like it needs to like and it's interesting, like I mean, design, like most of the time the teams are smaller, so it's easier to like kind of organize that sort of thing and like get a shared like we're gonna go like get people in the design process is easier when you're at like 5% of a company or something like that. Like, so you can self-organize a little bit better and then go out and like advocate the design process, and in the meantime like also like force the other way where you're reaching across because there's only there's few of you compared to like how many other people there are at the company. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to try to sneak in another question, even though they're trying to not have me sneak in. I'm going to try anyways. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, kind of explaining what you guys talked about. So you talked about kind of the cliche here a lot, designers should learn to code. My question is for you guys, how do you teach engineers to design and have good design and good design sense?
That's awesome. That's a great question too. All right, so I'm going to tell you this little story. So when I started Uber, there were about like 40, 50 engineers, right? And a bunch of like general managers and stuff. Design was probably just non-existent at Uber, right? You teach engineers, you teach GMs, you teach CEOs good design by doing and by talking about it and becoming advocates, right? Everybody's thirsty. Everybody has an opinion and everybody thinks that they're designers. To a certain degree, they are. It's allowing people to understand what good taste is, right? I went to, this is ridiculous, like I went to a ballet gala, don't ask me why, but I went to it and I met a coworker who was a community manager back in the day, and they were presenting a video on like raising funding for this ballet. And she comes up to me later and she goes, that was the worst video I've ever seen in my life. They needed some design help. And this girl, like out of nowhere, who has no design aesthetics, has just been around good design. And I I talk to her all the time. We talk about taste, and it's not just about like design, but you talk about the things, the details, you surround them with like, I don't know, just design culture. That's how you start forming, that's how you start influencing engineers and CEOs. You just start creating beautiful things, right? And there's always gonna be people that say, you know, no, it's arbitrary, that's not needed, like cars moving on a map, it's just ridiculous, like why would you ever do that? But fuck, it's kind of nice. It's really nice. And you're like, how do they do that? It's that battle that you fight every day, right? If it was easy, then you wouldn't be at work. You teach engineers, you teach GMs, and you teach CEOs just by doing, and becoming design advocates on a day-to-day basis for me.
You guys have anything on that?
The only thing I would throw in there is that a lot of it comes down to language, how you talk and how you present yourself, your work, your colleagues, why you made the decisions you made. The why, like over and over and over. And usually the why actually has a lot less to do with like the actual end pixel representation. Yeah. But I found over the years that talking about the why, especially with engineers, they get there really quickly because oh, got it, right. They're approaching the why from another angle, but they're still looking at solving that same thing. Yeah. And when you start talking about you know, human beings and behavior and the way that the psychology of color and type and space and these things, and really honestly, part of it is showing them, like you said, part of it is giving them a language and a way to talk about it themselves. One of my favorite things in the world has been a handful of engineers I worked with years and years and years ago that like occasionally send me emails with a screenshot of something horribly typeset. And
nice.
and they know why.
Yeah.
And they're like, I saw this today. So bad.
Yeah.
Right? Right?
Start.
And you're like, yes,
yeah.
One more type nerd converted. Okay, you know, but you're giving them a language. And honestly, like I could say the same thing about business. You could say the same thing about engineering. It's a language and it's a way of communicating and understanding the why and the how in a lot of ways.
So like I think that's like, I feel like a lot of that's true for the visual design part of what we do, but like the product experience and like how we're defining the user experience, like it actually, for us at Etsy, it comes down to like just involving people throughout the process and like bringing them along with us throughout the entire thing. So I'll give you an example. Like every designer at Etsy for a new project starts with these things, they just write something. It's the problems that we're trying to solve, the design tenets around like what a good solution might look like, and then if we're improving an existing product, what the strengths are that we'd like to like hold on to as we design this thing. They do that. It takes like 5 minutes. They send that to their entire team, and they're like, "Does this look right?" And it starts a discussion where you're talking about like all of a sudden like you have engineers, PMs, whoever, all saying like, "Well, I disagree that this is a problem," or "I think you missed this problem," or "This should be a goal," or whatever, right? And what happens is like now all of a sudden you're designing together. Like all of a sudden you have like this thing you're making, and you come out the other side. It usually takes like a day or two. It's usually not very it's not very intense because all it is a few lines of text. And you come out with like a document which essentially is like the agreement that everybody has like on like what's important and what you're going to tackle. So then like what we do is like just recently we're redesigning a piece of the site. We got the engineers that are working on it together, the PM, the user researcher, the designer, and myself, into a room, and we were like, okay, here's that document of all the stuff. In an ideal world where like nothing else matters, what would we do? Like, what are all the things? And like, basically what you would do anyway, right? This is what like any designer is going to do, is sit down and just like, what are all the things? Let's just put all the dumb ideas up, all the like things that will never work or are too expensive, whatever. Like, let's just do it, and like no judgment, and like that. And like those engineers have crazy ideas, like insane things. They know they can't do it, but they'll put them on the board anyway. And so we put all those things up, and then like we made that list. Like actually, like the designer spent like 2 or 3 days basically doing like a quick like mood board of all of those like what those things might look like. Just really fast wireframes, super dirty. Took a couple of days. We all got together again, looked at all those, like walked through them, she explained them, and then like silently we all, including the engineers, like stack ranked what we wanted to build. Like what are the top 3 things? If we could only do 3, what are they? And everybody said the same thing. Like there were like 25 things on this list, and like the engineers, the designers, and the PMs all like coalesced around like the same things. And all of a sudden, again, like we've designed this entire thing together so far, and now we're gonna wireframe it out. We're gonna build it together, right? And like that's like the next step, right? And it's just like, it's pretty powerful, and there's a lot of buy-in, and it makes people do harder things. Like because they were a part of the process, you're not showing them something and like having them react to a design. They're not reacting anymore. They're actually just participating. And you find out super early when things aren't going to work. You haven't designed anything yet. You know when disagreement happens before it happens because you wrote that stupid doc up, and it's great because you re-reference it every time you look at anything, and you're like, oh yeah, remember we all said these things. Do these things that we put together, like solve these problems, like and address these goals. Like done. We all agreed on these problems and goals. Also works great for executives. Really great. Like if you have anybody that you're reporting to that's not a designer that you show work to, that document will save your life. I don't know if I can tell a story. I'm going to tell it anyway.
Dem docs.
I'm going to tell it anyway.
Dem docs.
We used to present to Jeff. My group presented to Jeff Bezos fairly regularly at Amazon. And we always brought that doc with us to all the VP meetings and to him because like this guy's got like 45 things going on like every single day. And he didn't remember what we had agreed on last time we talked like 2 or 3 weeks ago. So we'd put that doc up and he'd read through it and be like, cool, got it. And we'd move on. And then like you'd get into it and he'd be like, well, I don't know where we saw, is this, like I think there's this problem here. And we'd be like, whoa, 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 wait, like remember that thing we talked about? And like nobody from designer to CEO will ever go back on an agreement they made. Like they're like, oh yeah, you're right, we did agree to that. And then you just get to move on with your life. And it also helps you focus people a lot better so they're not like pointing at like that icon over there I don't like. And you're like, that's not what we're talking about. But you're like, no, here like this document is what we're talking about like as we move forward into the design work. And so it gives you like a context for people that you're presenting to that are not designers. It helps you create agreement amongst your teammates and actually pull them along with you through the entire process so you're not surprising them or like having to teach them about design because they're just doing it and they don't even know it. Yeah.
Do you guys have any job openings?
We are definitely hiring. Yeah, so we're at
I'm
25. We will be at 30
I'm
this
happy
year.
for now, but
You know.
I'm asking for a friend.
Our creative director said to me once that he thought that I could sell him on working at Etsy even though he already works at Etsy. So it could be that I'm just really good at talking about it. You don't know.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, guys. This was amazing. I had a blast. I hope it was fun for everyone. We got to close up before I keep getting the evil eye from back there. So thanks so much, everyone. Let's give them a round of applause here.